3D imaging technicians scanned 2 mummies and took over 50,000 images.
Scientists are releasing new video showing X-rays of the alleged alien remains.
Well, researchers believe they've located the leading cause of death when it comes to mummies.
2 mummies, 2 women, buried in a Libyan rock shelter for 7,000 years alongside the remains of 13 other women and children. These were not Egyptian pharaohs wrapped in linen. These were ordinary people, naturally preserved in the desert heat, in a place that 7,000 years ago looked nothing like the wasteland it is today. When scientists finally sequenced their DNA, what came back from the lab rewrote the entire story of human ancestry. The results were so unexpected that one leading geneticist admitted that if told these genomes were 40,000 years old, he would have believed it. The world that was buried. Picture the Sahara Desert as it exists right now. Endless walls of sand in every direction. No water, no shade, no sign that anything has ever lived there. Surface temperatures that can hit 70 degrees Celsius and cook exposed skin in minutes. In southwestern Libya, the terrain gets so extreme that you cannot reach certain areas without a 4-wheel drive vehicle. There are no roads. There is no reason to go there. It looks and it feels like standing on another planet. But here is what makes that image so disturbing. 7,000 years ago, that exact stretch of land was a savanna. A full, breathing, living savanna with permanent lakes and flowing rivers. Hippopotamuses wallowed in those waters. Elephants moved through the grasslands. Fish filled the rivers. The biodiversity packed into that landscape rivaled anything alive in modern Europe today. The same coordinates. A completely different world. This was geology, not legend. Between 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, a climate event called the African Humid Period transformed the Sahara from the world's largest hot desert into one of its most fertile regions on Earth. The rains came, the land responded, and people moved in and built their lives there. One of those places was a rock shelter called Takar Kori in what is now southwestern Libya. Archaeological evidence shows that people had been living there continuously for more than 8,000 years, generation after generation, in a green and living Sahara, using this shelter as a home, a meeting place, and something else entirely. A place to bury their dead. The burial site at Takar Kori held the remains of 15 individuals, and the pattern of who was buried there is immediately striking. The dead were predominantly women and children, laid into the earth with deliberate care. This was intentional. These people had rituals. They had beliefs about death. They had a system for deciding who deserved to be remembered and how. A community whose entire existence was unknown to science had been conducting burial ceremonies in this rock shelter for thousands of years. Then the world they lived in began to die. Climate models suggest the Green Sahara did not fade gradually. It collapsed. Some researchers believe the shift happened over centuries, which in human terms means it happened fast. The lakes shrank, the rivers dried, the animals left or died, and the people who had built everything they knew inside this landscape were trapped inside a transformation they could not outrun. What they left behind in that rock shelter had been lying under the sand ever since. And in 2003, a team of scientists drove out into that dead landscape to find it. The excavation and the miracle of reading the dead. In 2003, Professor Savino Di Lernia led a team into the Libyan desert to excavate the Takar Kori rock shelter. Before they touched a single bone, they already knew this place was unusual. The surrounding rock faces were covered in thousands of engravings depicting cattle, humans, and wildlife, animals that had not lived in this region for thousands of years. The team was standing inside the remains of a vanished world, and they had not even started digging yet. On the second day, a researcher dragged a brush across the sand and felt something solid beneath it. They cleared more sand. A jawbone emerged from the earth. Di Lernia later described the moment in plain terms. "We scratched the sand and found the mandible." That sentence does not sound dramatic, but think about what it means. 2 centimeters below the surface of a dead desert, the jaw of a woman who had been lying there for 7,000 years was waiting to be found. As the excavation continued, the team uncovered 15 individuals in total. 2 of them stopped everyone cold. Their bodies had not decomposed. The skin was still there, the ligaments were still there, the tissue was still attached to the bone. In the heat of the Sahara, that level of preservation is almost unheard of. What the team was looking at were 2 naturally mummified women, darkened and dried by thousands of years of desert air, their features still partially visible beneath skin that had pulled tight against the bone. Delernia made the decision immediately. These 2 would be studied first. But studying them meant doing something that had never been successfully done before. To read ancient DNA, scientists need genetic material that is still intact at the molecular level. Heat destroys DNA fast. The Sahara cycles between extreme heat during the day and cold at night, and that combination breaks genetic material apart over time. Every previous attempt to recover usable DNA from human remains found in a comparable hot desert environment in North Africa had failed. Every single one. The team from the Max Planck Institute, led by archaeogeneticist Nada Salem, knew that soft tissue would give them nothing, so they went for the hardest material in the human body. They drilled into the teeth. They drilled into the leg bones. These are the structures where genetic material holds on the longest. But drilling meant destroying. There was no way to extract the material without permanently altering the remains, and there was no guarantee that anything viable would be recovered once they did. What came out of those bones was enough. The team built complete genome sequences from the recovered material, then compared them against 795 genomes from people alive today and 117 ancient genomes from across Africa, Southwest Asia, and Europe. Johannes Krauss, the senior author of the study and director at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, did not hide his reaction. "These samples come from some of the oldest mummies in the world," he said. "That we could sequence their entire genomes is a small miracle." It was the first time in scientific history that whole genomes had been recovered from human remains found in a hot, arid environment like this. The barrier had held for decades. These 2 women lying in the sand since before recorded history were the ones who finally broke it. The miracle was getting the data out. What the data actually said was something else entirely, because the moment the results came back, every assumption the team had walked in with fell apart at once. The ghost population. When the DNA results came back from the lab, the first thing the scientists checked was the one thing they were most confident about. During the Green Sahara, the African continent was one connected, open landscape. People and animals moved freely across it. Every geographic and biological logic pointed to one conclusion. The Takarkori women would carry DNA connecting them to sub-Saharan African populations. The assumption felt bulletproof. It was wrong. The Takarkori women carried 0 sub-Saharan African ancestry. Not a trace, not a fragment. 0. These women had lived during the most open, connected period in Saharan history, surrounded by a green corridor that stretched across the entire continent. And yet not a single genetic thread connected them to the populations living south of them. The scientists stared at those results and had no immediate explanation. So they went looking for the closest match. What they found was not nearby. The nearest known relatives of the Takarkori women were 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers buried in a cave called Taforalt in Morocco. A population that lived thousands of kilometers away, thousands of years earlier, in a completely different part of the continent. And yet the genetic signature connecting them to the Takarkori women was undeniable. The same deep ancestral thread ran through both populations, found nowhere else on Earth. What made the Taforal people even more unsettling was what their bones revealed about how they lived. Their teeth had been deliberately and systematically removed, not from decay or injury, but by choice. This was ritual. This was identity. These were people who marked themselves permanently and painfully as a form of social practice. The closest known relatives of the Takarkori women were a people defined by deliberate, irreversible ceremony written directly onto their bodies. Both populations, the Takarkori mummies and the Taforalt hunter-gatherers, traced back to a single ancient North African lineage that had no connection to sub-Saharan African populations whatsoever. A lineage that had existed along the northern edge of the continent for tens of thousands of years. Invisible to science, unnamed, and yet not entirely undetected. For years before this discovery, researchers studying the DNA of modern North Africans had been finding something they could not explain, a faint genetic signal, ancient and anomalous, that did not match any known population in the record. It kept appearing. They could map it. They could measure it. They just could not find where it came from because they had never found the physical remains of the people who carried it. So they gave this mystery population a name. They called it a ghost population. Nata Salem, who led the research, was direct about what Takarkori had just produced. Our research challenges previous assumptions about North African population history and highlights the existence of a deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage. Louise Humphrey of the Natural History Museum in London put it even more plainly. The DNA pointed to a previously unknown ancient lineage. Previously unknown, in 2023. A branch of humanity that science had no record of had just been found. But the deeper the researchers pushed into the genetic data, the stranger it got. Because what was waiting further back in this lineage's history was not just unexpected, it was the kind of finding that makes scientists go quiet. Frozen. 50,000 years while the world burned around them. After identifying the Taforalt connection, researchers pushed further back and compared the Takarkori genomes against some of the oldest human remains ever found outside of Africa. They landed on 50,000-year-old individuals from a site called Zlatý Kun in the Czech Republic, part of the very first wave of modern humans to ever leave the African continent. The Takarkori women were more closely related to these 50,000-year-old individuals than to any sub-Saharan African population alive today. This means the ancestors of these two women were connected to the first humans who walked out of Africa. At some point, researchers believe this group either turned back or split from the main migration and settled along the northern edge of the continent. And then they stopped moving, genetically frozen, completely unmixed, for 50,000 years. Consider everything that happened while this bloodline held still. The Neanderthals went extinct. The last ice age rose and collapsed. Mesopotamia built the first cities. Egypt raised the pyramids. Greece rose and fell. Rome rose and fell. The Renaissance happened. The Industrial Revolution happened. Humans landed on the moon. All of recorded human history occupies less than 1/10 of the time this population spent genetically unchanged in North Africa. Their immune systems and biological adaptations developed along a completely separate track from the rest of humanity. At the cellular level, they had been quietly diverging from every other human population for longer than most civilizations have existed. And here is what makes this impossible to explain. These people were not cut off from the world. They herded sheep, goats, and cattle. They used pottery. They had built a functioning farming community inside the Green Sahara. The animals they herded were domesticated in the Near East, and scientists had always used the spread of those animals to trace human migration. Wherever the animals went, the people followed. That was the established rule. At Takarkori, the animals arrived. The people who brought them did not. The pottery found at the site had been imported from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Nile Valley. Delernia confirmed it directly. We know now that they were isolated in terms of genetics, but not in cultural terms. They absorbed technology, animals, and ideas from every civilization around them. And they let none of it touch their bloodline. Johannes Krauss described them as living fossils clinging to their ancestral roots. researchers noted that nothing comparable had ever been documented, because in Europe, constant mixing between populations left no example of genetic continuity anywhere near this scale. This was not accidental. The Green Sahara was open. Traders reached them. Ideas reached them. They could have intermarried with outside groups across thousands of years of contact. The genetic record shows they never did. But 50,000 years of isolation still does not explain everything these women were carrying. Because buried deeper in their genome, older than the isolation and older than the Green Sahara, was the biological memory of the single most disturbing moment in the entire history of our species. Memory of the first crossing. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, a member of this lineage had a child with something that was not fully human. That is not a figure of speech. That is what the DNA shows. And the biological evidence of that event was still sitting intact and readable inside the bones of two women buried in the Libyan desert in 2023. When researchers went deeper into the Takakori genome data, they found a number nobody had been specifically looking for. The mummies carried Neanderthal DNA, approximately 0.15% of their total genome. That fraction needs context to be understood properly. Most people alive today whose ancestry runs through Europe or Asia carry between 1.5 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. That is the result of multiple rounds of interbreeding that happened as modern humans pushed deeper into Neanderthal territory over tens of thousands of years. The Takakori women carried roughly 1/10 of that amount. More than most sub-Saharan Africans who carry almost none, but far less than any European or Asian population. That number is not random. It is a timestamp. It marks the exact point in human history when this lineage made contact with the Neanderthal world and then stopped. The conclusion researchers reached was precise. The ancestors of the Takakori women encountered Neanderthals during the first wave of the out-of-Africa migration, approximately 50,000 years ago. They picked up that genetic trace right at the beginning. Then they separated from the rest of the migrating population, returned to or remained on the northern edge of Africa, and that Neanderthal inheritance was never added to again. It was never diluted by further contact. It sat in their cells untouched for 50,000 years. The connection to the Zlatý Kun woman from the Czech Republic becomes even more significant here. She carried the longest and least fragmented Neanderthal DNA sequences of almost any ancient human ever identified, which placed her at the absolute earliest moment of human Neanderthal interbreeding. The Takakori ancestors were connected to this same lineage. Researchers believe these women's ancestors were present at or within 1 or 2 generations of the moment modern humans first crossed that biological boundary. It is also worth understanding what Neanderthals actually were. By 50,000 years ago, they had been living across Europe and West Asia for at least 200,000 years. They made tools. They buried their dead. Evidence suggests they may have created cave art. This was not a meeting between modern humans and something primitive. It was a meeting between two separate human species, both with long histories, and the Takakori lineage preserved the record of that meeting in a form cleaner and less overwritten than almost any population science has ever found. The Neanderthals were gone by approximately 40,000 years ago. The Takakori women died 7,000 years ago. That means they were carrying the genetic memory of a species that had been extinct for 33,000 years before they themselves were even born. But no matter how ancient or extraordinary this lineage was, something was coming for it. The Sahara had already swallowed their world once, and it was not finished. The erasure. No army destroyed them. No disease swept through the population. No rival group drove them out. What ended the ghost population was something that did not even know they existed. The African humid period collapsed, and the world that had kept this lineage alive for 50,000 years simply stopped existing around them. The end was not quiet. Archaeological evidence pulled from sites across the Sahara shows that the dying was visible. For thousands of years, the people of the Green Sahara had been carving images into rock faces across the region. Cattle, humans, wildlife, scenes of daily life. Then, as the aridification accelerated, the character of that rock art changed. The images became sparse, the subjects shifted, and then the carvings stopped altogether. The last people who made them left no explanation. They just stopped. The silence after the final image is total. As the lakes dried and the grasslands turned to sand, everything that had made the Takarkori people's way of life possible collapsed at once. The trade routes fell apart. The grazing grounds disappeared. The watering holes that had connected communities across the Green Sahara dried up and vanished. The conditions that had allowed this population to stay genetically separate while remaining culturally connected to the outside world no longer existed. And without those conditions, the boundaries they had maintained for 50,000 years could not hold. They were absorbed into the broader North African populations around them. Their language disappeared. Their social structures dissolved. Everything they knew about living in the Green Sahara became useless knowledge in a world that had turned to desert. A lineage that had survived ice ages and climate shifts and millennia of contact with outside civilizations was finally undone, not by anything that targeted them, but by the ground disappearing beneath their feet. Some researchers believe the collapse of the Green Sahara directly contributed to the rise of pharaonic Egypt. The theory is that the people displaced by the dying Sahara moved into the Nile corridor, bringing their cattle, their knowledge, and their social organization with them, and that this influx of population and skill helped drive the complexity that produced one of history's greatest civilizations. The Takarkori people had been trading with Nile Valley communities before the collapse. It is possible they contributed something to that process without leaving a single traceable mark in the historical record. What remained of them after the absorption was almost nothing. Fragments of the ghost population's genetic signature survive today in the DNA of modern North African communities, particularly among the Amazigh people of North Africa. There are millions of living people who carry a trace of this lineage in their cells and have no way of knowing it. No cultural memory, no oral history, no name for what their ancestors were. And what the Sahara has not yet returned is almost certainly greater than what it has given back. The desert covers an area the size of the United States. Researchers believe there are more naturally preserved bodies lying in rock shelters across Libya, Algeria, Chad, and Niger, each one potentially carrying genome sequences that could force the entire story of human history to be rewritten again. The two women found at Takarkori were not the end of anything. They were the first crack in the sand,